Our next speaker is Jeremy Ward. He's the father of 3 young adults, the eldest of whom live with disabilities and required support to live in her own home for over 10 years. His older sister also had a lifelong disability. Jeremy has many years' experience in the law as it relates to people with disabilities and in working in advocacy organisations with people with disabilities and families. Jeremy was instrumental in the establishment of Queensland Advocacy Incorporated, where he worked for over 10 years as an advocate, lawyer and director. He was a member of the formerly Intellectually Handicapped Citizens Council of Queensland and was a legal member of the former Queensland Guardianship and Administration Tribunal and is a former senior member of the Commonwealth Veterans Review Board. In 2002, Jeremy established Pave the Way, a whole-of-life and succession planning project located at Mamre Association, where he worked in various roles until 2012. He now undertakes a small amount of consultancy work in the areas of future planning, leadership, development and advocacy, and continues with some voluntary involvements and always steps up for QAI when we ask him, and we are always appreciative. I'd like you to welcome Jeremy Ward.
Thank you, Michelle. I'd like to dedicate this paper to the memory of my sister Margaret, who died 4 years ago today. Born with cerebral palsy, she lived for 17 years in a special purpose nursing home before she was given an opportunity to, in her words, escape, moving first to share houses and finally into her own 2-bedroom unit, where she spent the last 15 years of her life in her own home. Margaret moved to Sevenoaks at the age of 26 when our mother became ill. That was 1970, and Sevenoaks was seen then as innovative. I was unaware until much later just how much Margaret disliked her time there. In a speech given in 1996, she spoke of the 10 p.m. curfews, being put in her dressing gown before the 5 p.m. tea time if she was showered before tea, with the gown on back to front because it was easier for staff that way. Being left in the bathroom for an hour while staff went to have their morning tea or because they simply forgot her, and taking turns to get out of bed at 5 a.m, even during winter, to suit the scheduling of staff. Compared to some institutions that will be talked about today and have been mentioned already, Sevenoaks looked quite welcoming. A modern, low-set brick building in attractive grounds in leafy middle-class Brisbane suburb with a large swimming pool. It was, I think, the only nursing home at the time, at least, in Australia with a licensed bar. But it was an institution nevertheless, with institutional practices as Margaret's recounting of her experiences shows. There are still places like this being built today. My first encounter with large institutions was as a young lawyer visiting people in prisons, including people with psychiatric and intellectual disabilities, incarcerated at Her Majesty's pleasure, deemed unfit to plead to the charges they faced, and so locked up indefinitely, often for offences that would not have warranted a prison term had they been allowed to enter a plea and been convicted. But it was not until I was appointed to the former Intellectually Handicapped Citizens Council in 1986 that I was exposed to places like the Challinor Centre and Basil Stafford Training Centre to Brisbane's west, to Bailey Henderson Hospital in Toowoomba and the Disabled Persons Ward at Maryborough Hospital. Part tribunal and part government advisory body with a community education role in the area of intellectual handicap, as it was then described. The council was chaired by Lionel Rackley, a feisty World War II veteran whose brother had lived at Challinor. Under his leadership, the council took an assertive approach to its powers to liaise with government departments and other organisations and to provide advice to the minister. When we were taken on a tour of the Challinor Centre, the chairman led us down corridors not included in the tour schedule, showing us huge open bathrooms with no doors on toilets or shower recesses, and large flat-bottomed stainless steel troughs in which residents were hosed down. In the older buildings, residents shared large dormitories with their beds separated only by cupboards and wardrobes. we saw a young woman in a cage, yes, a cage, in an open area behind one of the buildings. On a visit to Bailey Henderson in Toowoomba, we saw a separate ward for residents with brain injuries and intellectual disability. I remember one young woman in a wheelchair who appeared to be in her early teens, sitting doing nothing. As we left the ward, a man lay unattended in a pool of urine in the hallway. The council held hearings in Maryborough and visited the disabled persons ward in the local hospital, where we saw residents with intellectual disability wasting away their lives in hospital beds or in beanbags. At council hearings, we heard evidence of residents' treatment, of the lack of meaningful day activities, and of some people staying in bed most of the day. We heard of bathing without any privacy, again in large stainless steel troughs, and staff competing against each other to see how quickly they could feed the residents. We learnt that the public trustee, appointed as financial manager for all residents, had pooled the residents' trust funds to pay for a hospital swimming pool, which residents rarely used, but which hospital staff no doubt enjoyed. The council members took the view that our power to provide advice to the government constituted an advocacy role. We wrote a report to the Health Minister, highly critical of the treatment of residents, advice which was not welcomed. Soon after, when amendments to the Intellectually Handicapped Citizens Act came before Parliament, we were all present to hear the debate. We met with the Minister responsible. He looked us all in the eye and told us that he was mostly happy with the implementation of the original legislation, but for one mistake that he had made, the appointments that he had made to the council. Excuse me. We had thick skins. He later became embroiled in the Fitzgerald inquiry and was forced to resign, subsequently being imprisoned for misappropriating public funds. The movement to seek alternatives to large institutions began in the post-World War II years, when parents like mine decided that the lack of education opportunities and other services for people like my sister was simply not good enough. That's why they built places like Sevenoaks, because there was simply nothing else on offer, apart from the large draconian psychiatric hospitals and places like the Dunwich Benevolent Asylum on Stradbroke Island. One early QAI committee member, Ray Babington, had lived at Dunwich, being sent there at the age of 2 in 1933. There was no support provided to individuals or to their families at that time. In the 1960s, the state government moved to establish so-called training centres for people with intellectual disability to separate them from those with mental illness, such as the Challinor Training Centre and the Basil Stafford Training Centre. In the early 1980s, in moves then seen as innovative, people began to move into government group homes in what became known as the Alternative Living Service, or ALS. These group homes operated under a new non-medical model framework, with staff trained as residential care officers rather than nurses, though people were still grouped and segregated and abuse and neglect still occurred. So it was against this background and history that the growth of independent advocacy in the 1980s led families, people with disability and supportive professionals to join together in campaigns to have the large institutions closed. Some of this advocacy was carried out by individual advocacy groups such as Queensland Parents of the Disabled, as it was then known, now Queensland Parents for People with Disability, or QPPD, Queensland Advocacy Incorporated, Self-Advocacy Support Service, or SAS, the precursor of what is now known as Speaking Up For You, SUFI, as well as a number of other organisations across the state, such as Advocacy in the Tropics in Townsville. Advocacy groups joined together with others, people from small services, on-site professionals and other allies under the original Safeguards Coalition. Advocacy groups became more focused in their advocacy, having learnt more about the principles and elements of social advocacy through attending workshops by Professor Wolf Wolfensberger and Michael Kendrick. QAI adopted its current mission statement with a focus on those who are most vulnerable. With this emphasis on those who are most vulnerable, the closure of the Challinor Centre was given priority in those early advocacy campaigns. Challinor had a long history as a Dickensian-like institution on the outskirts of Ipswich, and you've seen an image of the original building today. Located in buildings like that dated back to the 1880s, Challinor became the focus of a government decision in the 1960s to make Ipswich the centre for adults with intellectual disability and Walston Park at Goodna the centre for people with mental illness. People were swapped from one to the other according to their diagnosis. Despite people being moved into the alternate living service group homes, there were still nearly 200 residents at Challinor in the early 90s. While we were certainly not supportive of the ALS group homes as a solution to people's lives, and we were indeed disturbed by what we were hearing about them, and in fact became involved in some specific advocacy in a number of cases, the focus of our energy was on the closure of Challinor, believing that the folks still there were the most vulnerable. Advocacy for the closure of Challinor did not mean closure at any cost. We emphasised the importance of a planned closure with well-considered individualised solutions to where residents would live. If residents had family, we wanted them included in the process. We wanted the closure of Challinor, but we wanted it done properly. That would all cost money, particularly in the transition period, while Challinor remained open at the same time as residents were supported to move into their own homes in the community. So when the government decided to sell Challinor to the University of Queensland under a very tight time frame for closure in 1998, suddenly we had a new set of issues. At that time there were still 144 residents at Challinor. There had been a government institutional reform program in place for some time, with some very good purpose-built individual housing developed across the state, and some Challinor residents had moved out under that scheme. But we still had grave concerns about how the needs of that last group would be addressed. Claiming that 40 families had chosen residential care, the government proposed 2 new residential facilities, one at Ipswich and one at Logan, to take up to 24 people each. Perhaps their worldview had 24 apostles. This was hardly our idea of community living, so our advocacy moved to opposing the building of those facilities. Advocating for a well-planned transition for those remaining residents into homes of their own became more subtle and more nuanced, and the outcomes, I have to say, were certainly mixed. The Basil Stafford Training Centre had been established as an institution for children. By the late 80s, early 90s, many, of course, had grown to adulthood. There was a much stronger group of families who wanted Basil Stafford to remain open than was the case with Challinor. So our advocacy involved meeting with the Parent Association and dealing with opposition by individual families. Though some wanted their families moved out, many were ambivalent and some were fiercely determined that their family members would remain at Basil Stafford. This was a difficult, challenging time when the respect for families, many of whom had never been given an alternative, needed to be balanced against what we believed was in the best interests of the residents. There were, however, many who had complaints about abuse and neglect at Basil Stafford, even if they didn't always believe that finding an alternative way of living for their family member was the solution. By the early 90s, the Queensland Criminal Justice Commission had been established in the wake of the Fitzgerald inquiry, with powers that included dealing with complaints about government-run institutions and the power to set up an inquiry if the CJC thought the level of complaints warranted such action. QAI, QPPD and others assisted families and interested individuals to lodge complaints with the CJC and advocated strongly for an inquiry. When the stream of complaints reached the point where the CJC decided to hold an inquiry headed by Justice Stewart, QAI sought leave to appear before the inquiry on behalf of all Basil Stafford residents. We briefed a young barrister, Stephen Keim, and the legal arguments around standing or a right of appearance began. For those non-lawyers amongst you, this meant we had to convince Justice Stewart that we had a right to represent people who were considered unable, through a lack of recognised legal capacity, to give us instructions to do so, and or that QAI was a person concerned under the provisions of the Criminal Justice Commission Act. Justice Stewart refused QAI a right of appearance, so QAI applied to the Supreme Court for judicial review of his decision. QAI was successful in that application and the issue went back to Justice Stewart. He gave QAI a limited right of appearance, which amounted to QAI being allowed to be present during the Commission proceedings, to receive a copy of the transcript, of proceedings at no cost and to make written submissions to the inquiry. However, the public trustee was not happy with even that limited right of appearance being given to a mere advocacy organisation. So they lodged an appeal to the Queensland Court of Appeal. They argued that because they managed the financial affairs of all residents at Basil Stafford under the draconian mishmash of laws that passed for guardianship legislation in those days, they had the broad interests of the residents at heart and the exclusive right to represent them before the inquiry. QAI was faced with scrutiny of its mission and objects by 3 Court of Appeal judges. While one of the judges determined that QAI should be granted a much more substantive right of appearance, he was outnumbered by his 2 colleagues, and QAI's limited right of appearance before the inquiry remained. The Stewart inquiry attracted a lot of media attention. Under that scrutiny and under pressure from advocates, the government announced, even before Justice Stewart brought down his report, that Basil Stafford would close in the next 3 to 4 years. That was in 1994, now 20 years ago. When Justice Stewart delivered his report, it made chilling reading. He wrote of an insidious institutional culture which promoted the occurrence of client abuse and gross neglect, and the harassment or intimidation of staff members who reported or could have reported such occurrences by other staff members. He recommended that one residential care officer be referred to the Director of Public Prosecutions for prosecution for a criminal offence, and a number of others referred to the Misconduct Tribunal of the CJC. His primary recommendation, however, was that Basil Stafford should be closed as soon as possible, with other recommendations concerning how that should occur, what sort of training should be provided to staff, and in the meantime, and how advocacy groups such as QAI should be involved. So then our advocacy campaign moved on to trying to ensure that the government followed the recommendations and adhered to its decision to close the institution. And you can see how successful that was. All the while, QAI and others worked on campaigns directed on the closure of other institutions. Calling together a group of local people, QAI embarked on a campaign to have the Disabled Persons Ward at Maryborough Hospital closed. QAI staff visited Maryborough regularly, facing great resistance to gain access to the ward and to residents. When one resident died, QAI became involved in a coronial inquest, thereby gaining access to information that would not normally have been available to independent advocates, information that could be used in the campaign. That wasn't the only reason we got involved, of course. The publicity around the inquest and the economics of keeping the ward open led to a decision for it to be closed. Gradually, residents were moved with funding from the institutional reform program, with some moving into their own homes for the very first time, with the assistance of a local family-governed service. And there were other campaigns around institutions in those days, including in relation to the Challinor Centre, part of Royal Brisbane Hospital, the ward at Bailey Henderson, Cootharinga Nursing Home in Townsville, and the notorious Ward 10B psychiatric ward at Townsville Hospital. When an inquiry into a number of deaths at Ward 10B was set up by the Queensland Government in the early 90s, Advocacy in the Tropics in Townsville became involved with legal advisory support from QAI. The advocacy strategies used over those years were many and varied. We lobbied government and visited Parliament House during parliamentary sittings when relevant legislation was being debated, or to meet with parliamentarians when they were all in town. The wheelchair access to Old Parliament House was a steep temporary ramp hauled out when required. On one occasion we had 5 or 6 people in wheelchairs speeding up the ramp and then through the corridors of power as ministerial staffers sidestepped their advance and parliamentary attendants tried to keep up. We marched in the streets, beginning with an assembly of speakers at the Roma Street Forum. The concrete podium was not wheelchair accessible, so a young parent, Michelle O'Flynn, organised a timber ramp at the last minute. We then marched down George Street and occupied the space below the Executive Building, from where we called for the Minister to come down to talk to us, before releasing hundreds of yellow balloons as a symbol of granting people freedom. The Minister didn't come down, but he did invite a delegation up to his office. We issued media releases, organised radio and television interviews and reports, including the Four Corners program Asylum in 1996. excerpts from which I believe will be shown today. In those pre-internet days, the fax machine was king, though in the very early days of QAI we didn't even own our own fax. So we used a public fax machine at the GPO. When we graduated to owning our own machine, we would set it on time delay to spray media releases out into the dead of night, ready for the early morning news programs. Early morning calls from journalists became the norm. As I have outlined, QAI also used legal advocacy to further these campaigns, such as the legal intervention in the Stewart inquiry and seeking leave to successfully to appear at a number of coronial inquests. QAI and others also engaged in a great deal of law reform activity during that period, and as it still does, of course, some of which complemented the institutional reform campaigns, such as the reform of guardianship laws and changes to the Coroners Act. This was a time of much energy and much angst over whether the right advocacy decisions were being made and whether the best strategies were being followed. We experienced the cost of advocacy, whether through being confronted in the street by parents who opposed the closure of the institutions, or receiving angry phone calls, or being attacked in newsletters by groups opposed to the stance we were taking. Politicians sympathetic to our cause when in opposition turned against us once in government, when our continuing advocacy targeted them. But it was also possible to have some fun. When QAI met with government ministers and senior departmental staff, as we always went as a group, with at least one member of the management committee included. On one occasion, when the government brochure promoting its latest innovative program was covered in butterfly images, I wore a bow tie covered in butterflies to a meeting with departmental officials. The visual reference seemed to escape them, but Donna Best, one of the QAI committee members in the delegation, struggled to keep a straight face throughout the entire meeting. So what can I, in reflection, say that I've taken from those days, which I'd like to share with you? Well, there are a number of messages. First, it's very important not to forget the people. I mean, that's obvious, but you can get, driven by other agendas. We needed to be conscious of the reality that our advocacy could be costly to the people with disability residing in the institutions and who were the subject, the institutions that were the subject of our advocacy. We might never know. We might have never known if staff took out their anger at us on those residents, but we could at least pledge to do our best to be there for them if such incidents were brought to our attention. Second, be clear about the advocacy goal. We wanted the closure of institutions, but not at any cost. Closure of the buildings was just one step along the way to achieving what we really wanted, a safe, secure, meaningful, good life for all residents of those institutions in homes of their own. Third, be clear about advocacy principles. As we learnt more about the principles of social advocacy, we were better able to craft our decisions and strategies. There were many issues to take up, as there still are and always will be, so we looked again and again at those principles to guide us. We learned always to be on the side of those for and with whom we were advocating, to focus on their fundamental needs, hence advocating for the closure of the institutions rather than merely to make them better, even if that were possible. We tried to be vigorous in our advocacy, to be accountable and loyal, and to avoid, where possible, conflicts of interest. When the going was tough, we could look to those principles for guidance. The principle to show fidelity, to stick to the advocacy no matter what, gave us strength when the going was tough, and it was important for it, and gave us guidance, if you like, to stick to our decisions over the long term. Next, included people with real lived experience. And Graham spoke movingly earlier about this. We found that having people with lived experience involved in the campaigns gave us important grounding focus. Born in Cairns in 1931, Ray Babington, who I mentioned earlier, was sent to the Montrose home in Brisbane as a baby before being sent to Dunwich at the age of 2. He lived in a total of 10 institutions, psychiatric hospitals, nursing homes, other homes, before, in his words, he got out at the age of 57 to live in his own unit for the first time for the last 10 years of his life, and a more charming man you could not have come across. Having people like Ray around the table, Having people like Ray around the table, and there were others, some of whom are here today, meant that it was not difficult to see that what we were advocating for was right. Next, take care when working with politicians, including the opposition, or those in opposition. We found that it was not difficult to develop good relationships with politicians, particularly those in opposition, when it suited their political agenda to embrace what we were advocating for. But we learnt to remember that their goals were different from ours. Individual politicians might also have wanted the change we wanted, but rarely at the cost of their not gaining or retaining government. While many politicians also want change, they want to do so through government, with all the compromises that entails. Next, take care in working with the media. We found that many in the media wanted a story above else, whereas we wanted our issues to have wide exposure. They always wanted a personal angle, and often wanted us to introduce them to a person with disability or a family, and we knew that such individual media exposure often comes at a cost. When the ABC was filming Asylum, the reporter asked us for an introduction to a young woman we had told him about, a woman who had moved out of one of the large institutions very successfully with support from her family, a family who had previously been very negative about that move. We said we would need to get the young woman's and the family's permission, and we would let him know the following day. We did so, and when we contacted the reporter the next day, he said he'd already found the family and been out there to interview them. Finally, review, evaluate often and rigorously. This can be frustrating to those who like to just get on with it. But we learnt that unless we were clear about what we were doing and why, just getting on with it could be wasteful and even counterproductive and damaging to vulnerable people. 2 comprehensive external evaluations of QAI in 1992 and 1997 certainly assisted QAI greatly to keep on track and refocus priorities, and other advocacy groups have also embraced regular reviews and evaluations. So, in conclusion, I hope this brief overview of the advocacy campaigns of the 1980s and 90s that focused on the closure of institutions has been of some help today. Those weren't the only advocacy campaigns at that time, but they proved to be amongst the most difficult and enduring, with still much to be done. I'm sure much of what I've talked about is no news to many of you here today, and I thank you for the opportunity to take a trip down memory lane. Thank you.